Deputy Boyd Barrett, the floor is yours.
Count Corla, we needed, Count Corla, we...
No, wait now. Please, we're running over time. We're going to be here till midnight. Would you please let people get on with their contributions?
Count Corla, we needed a radical budget to deal with the threat of a no-deal Brexit, to deal with the disastrous housing and homelessness crisis, to deal with the crisis in our public health system, to deal with the climate emergency, to deal with the astronomical cost of childcare, to deal with the woefully inadequate disability and respite services in this country, and in a whole range of other areas. But we didn't get a radical budget. We didn't get radical action on any of these crises or threats or emergencies that face us. We got a deeply conservative budget that will address none of these crises or emergencies. And working people, pensioners, young people, those dependent on social welfare got nothing. Absolutely nothing. And by getting nothing, they have in effect taken cuts. That's the reality. By imposing a freeze on the incomes of the poorest people in this country and on working people, giving them absolutely nothing, you have in effect cut their incomes. Now, you may believe that that is prudent in the face of the threat of a no-deal Brexit. In fact, it is repeating the folly of how you reacted to the last major crisis, the crash of 2008, where austerity and keeping a clamp or cutting the incomes of working people made a bad situation a hell of a lot worse. And we are still paying for those mistakes. With the housing crisis that we are now facing, with the mess in our public health system, with shocking levels of poverty, where 720,000 people in this country live in poverty, including 230,000 children. 100,000 people who are working in this country are officially living in poverty. So their incomes, in effect, by you giving no increases in social welfare or no relief on the austerity USC that was imposed on workers all those years ago, have in effect cut their incomes. And that is a big mistake, and you don't have to be a radical socialist to think so. This was a point John Maynard Keynes made a long time ago. When you are facing a potential downturn or disruption in an economy, you spend more. You boost people's incomes. You increase investment in infrastructure, in key sectors of the economy, in services. You've done the opposite to that. Prudence, so-called prudence. Conservatism in reality, which will make potentially a bad situation worse. And I think it's very important to underline the point about workers getting nothing, because you only have to walk out to the canteen to talk to workers. They're saying it already. And they're saying it out on the streets, we got nothing out of this budget. That's the reality. And that's against a background where the productivity of workers in this country has gone through the roof in recent years. Workers are working harder and longer, effectively for less, and making a bigger tax contribution than they have ever done. Do you know the tax contribution of ordinary workers in this country has gone from 13 billion in 2007 to 21 billion today? So workers working harder and longer for less and paying more tax, and then you want to impose a carbon tax on top of that as well. More aggressive taxation to further cut the real incomes of working people and the least well off. And let's not forget about our students, who got nothing in this. They asked for a break on student contribution fees, for some increase in maintenance grants. Nothing. In effect, driving more and more students into poverty, who are also facing the astronomical rents and the failure of the government to build cheap, affordable student accommodation on university campuses and on third-level campuses, which is what the students asked for. They got none of it. None of it. But meanwhile, all the big tax breaks continue for the big corporations. So we have carbon taxes for the poor and for the struggling, who are not to blame for the climate emergency, but the big polluting corporations, no mention of them. No mention of them. Even the EU have proposed that there would be an aviation fuel tax, which, if it was imposed on the Ryanairs of this world, in this country, would raise hundreds of millions. Hundreds of millions. But we never talk about taxing the massively profitable aviation industry and the other polluting corporations. No, you always want to hit the working people, the poor, the little people, who are asked to pay the price for the crimes of the rich. And on the issue of housing, I mean, really, it's just unbelievable. Do you not understand that your policy is failing? That 8 or 9 years, what is it, 9 years now since Fine Gael, 8 years since Fine Gael come into government, and more than 3 years of this government, and the situation continues to get worse. Rents at absolutely astronomical levels. Average rents in Dublin way in excess of what you'd pay for a mortgage, and ordinary working people can't afford a mortgage either, because house prices are so high. I even heard Tom Parlin, hardly a firebrand of the left, on the radio, on the television before I came in here, reminding us that you have to be on 90 or 100,000 euro a year to have a prayer of buying a house at average house prices in Dublin. And mortgages are cheaper than the rents that you're being charged in Dublin. So how wealthy do you have to be to pay the average rent prices in Dublin of 2,000, or in my area 2,200 or 2,400 a month? Who can afford that? But of course there's a group of people making money out of it. And what are you doing to tax them? The vulture funds, the cuckoo funds, the big corporate landlords, who, as we speak, in my area and several areas across this city, are moving to evict. I have to go to the PRTB tomorrow with tenants from my area who are facing the 4th attempt in 2 years by a vulture fund to evict them. And tomorrow, thresholds believe that they will finally succeed in getting all these people out. And then they'll be arriving down to Dún Laoghaire County Council and presenting as homeless. It's shocking, because of the loopholes you have left in the legislation that allows them to do this. And by the way, breaking news for the journalists and so on, no, 27 million euro cut in central government funding for local government in the budget estimates book, a 13% cut. So check it, I think it's on page 53, you can check it there, 27 million euro cut in local government. Now when the local property tax was introduced by you guys, which we opposed, which we said was regressive, one of the selling points of the local property tax supposedly would be there would be more money for local government. That has not happened. Local government resources have been reduced, and their ability to provide services and so on have been reduced, and then the central government funding has been reduced as well, and in this budget by another 13%. But of course, that's in line with Fine Gael policy when you look at the housing issue and what the whole thrust, yet again, of this budget is. More money to private landlords in the form of HAPs. More money to private developers in the form of LEHAF. And RAS payments and so on. And the vast majority, in the little argument and quibbles we're having about how much social housing is being delivered, right? What those figures that you're quoting, Finian, are including are Part 5s, in other words, houses built by the private sector, which are then being sold back, or more often leased, by the local authorities at astronomical prices, again benefiting the cuckoo funds. You know, in a place called Coolanore, in my area, there's been about 5 full apartment blocks sold en bloc, hundreds and hundreds in each block, to vulture funds in the last year or so. I made a point of it at Leaders' Questions here one day to the Minister, right? many of those are then now HAP tenancies, where these cuckoos, who are also benefiting by big tax breaks, what's the Section 1110, where they don't pay, if they invest in Irish property for a certain amount of time, they don't pay any tax on the rental income, they don't pay any tax on the capital gains they're making while the value of the property is going through the roof, and then in a triple whammy, they then lease the properties are leased off them by the local authorities at astronomical prices. So this is where all of the money, extra money you're crowing about in housing is actually going. The numbers of actual, real council houses that are being built are abysmal. Abysmal. Everything else is money going out the door into the pockets of NAMA developers who you've rehabilitated, vulture funds and cuckoo funds and big corporate landlords. They are the ones making a killing. That is the reality. Nothing about rents. What have you done to control rents? They're out of control. Nothing. You refuse to do it. You refuse to impose rent controls, which are standard all across Europe, where local authorities or rental sector regulators will actually set rents at affordable levels. They'll just say you can't charge more than this for that property. We're not letting you. That's how you control rents. Instead of these rent pressure zones, which in any event are finding their way around, but have completely failed to address the rental crisis. And of course, there are many victims of these failed policies of yours, but young people in particular, I think we should single out as a group who've really been failed at so many levels in this budget. Failed in terms of the climate, because the planet is burning and you're doing nothing about it. The cost of accommodation, absolutely out of control, completely unaffordable. The cost of educating yourself, completely impossible for many young people. Young people are being shafted, and there's nothing done for them in this budget. Now, what are the positive things you could have done on issues like climate change to protect the future of our young people? Instead of this regressive, unfair carbon tax, you could have and should have introduced free public transport and bring the level of public subsidy for public transport in this country at least up to the average level of the European Union, which we are well below. Well below. Luxembourg has already introduced free public transport, again hardly a bastion of radical socialism. They have it in Estonia, they're doing it in particular cities in parts of Europe, and in almost every part of Europe, public transport fares are way below what they are here. We're an outlier along with the UK. Somebody was telling me they were in Eastern Europe and they could go anywhere. I think it was in, I can't remember the country, I think it was Czechoslovakia or something. They could go anywhere for about 50 cents, right? Absolutely dirt cheap compared to what it is here. That's what you, what? It may not be, I may have the country wrong, you're absolutely right. Actually, it was Russia. Funny enough, it was Russia. Yeah, so, and if they can do it, and they're not a bastion of good anything, but at least they can provide cheap public transport. A major national insulation programme, right, to actually, instead of punishing people with carbon taxes, reduce people's fuel bills by having a major national insulation programme. And I mean, the unfairness of this for people who live in public housing is really gross, right? Because if you're in public housing, you can't retrofit your own home, you have to wait for the council to do it, right? And they're doing it at about 2% of the housing stock a year in my area, and I suspect it's similar everywhere else. So that people in public housing have no control whatsoever over the BER ratings of their home, or the capacity to micro-generate their own power and electricity, right? So it is completely regressive and unjust to impose carbon and taxes increases on people like that. In developing renewable energy and investing in our universities to develop new forms of renewable energy, our universities are chronically underfunded, and most of the R&D resources that the government provided are going to the big multinational corporations in the R&D tax credit, which is running at about €700 million a year and is mostly going to benefit the Googles, the Facebooks, the Apples, and all these people. Now, should all that state money, that's public money just as much as everything that was declared today, 700 million in R&D, tax relief, mostly going to them. That's not going to boost the domestic economy. It's not going to boost our universities. It's not going to develop renewable energy resources. It's going into what? Apple coming up with the Apple 11 upgrade. And then it'll be the Apple 12 upgrade. Right? Is that what we need, or would we want money put into developing renewable energy, or afforestation, which we discussed last week, failing consistently to meet our afforestation targets, when we know there's a benefit to all of these things? For every tree you plant, you will be paying less in fines to the EU. And yet we consistently fail to hit our targets in afforestation and developing a sustainable forestry industry. A few other things I just want to mention before my time is up. Disability services, something that should be close to your heart. Finian, various disability groups asked for a package of €211 million a year extra every year over the next 5 years, particularly for community disability services. What do we actually get in the budget? 25 million. 1/10 of what is being asked for by the disability community. Okay, it is pathetic, and this is against the background of us ratifying the UN CRPD. Where is universal accessibility? Where's the extra investment going into that? Where is the special needs assessment for people with special needs? Not mentioned that I can see in the health section of the budget, where the government is in breach of the law, where people are waiting 2 and 3 years for assessment, children with special needs, when the law requires that those assessments should be done within 6 months. Right, so we are failing, and you have failed, to actually support people with disability in this country. Pathetic amount of money for housing adaptation grants, and of course no increases in the disability allowance or the carers allowance. Shocking. Absolutely shocking. Again, effectively a cut for people with disability. Children and youth affairs. 29 million extra to Tusla sounds good, except in my area, a little service that I've raised about 5 or 6 times, the Cottage Home Family Support Service, which is providing vitally needed interventions for families at risk and children at risk, has closed this week for the lack of €200,000. 200,000. And I have raised this repeatedly with the Minister, begging. They are begging for the money. Right? And this is going to cost the state a lot more money. If those kids and those families don't get that support, they're going to turn up somewhere else in the system with much greater needs. And for the lack of 200,000 quid, so even at this point, on their behalf, I want to ask, they said they need 400,000 quid to keep the service going. They said they'll raise 200,000 themselves. Could the government give 200,000 to the Cottage Home service in order to keep that vital service? You know, and you're always talking about early intervention with children and all the rest of it. Does it mean anything at all? All their referrals come from Tusla, Cottage Home service. They are in effect a branch of Tusla. So please give them the 200,000 they need to keep going. And what about childcare? Right? Do you know when the National Childcare Scheme was announced? 2016. You've been announcing it every year for 4 years, and it's still not open. Right? And this is sort of typical of what this government does. Great headlines, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're doing the other, and in this case, you know, with childcare costs now nearly 2 mortgages in many cases that people are paying in childcare costs. A scheme you announced 4 years ago still isn't open, and when it does open, it's going to be pretty derisory what people get, and it certainly won't compensate for the dramatic increase in childcare costs that have ensued in the period since. Now, I want to conclude in my last 2 minutes by saying, you know, would it be possible, you know, because people say, is it possible to do all these things that the left are asking for, the socialists are asking for? Is the money available? And the answer is yes, Because you see, against all of the threats and the difficulties, the reality is Ireland is richer than it's ever been, ever. National household wealth has increased by €300 million in the last 5 years. But the problem is, all of that wealth is concentrated in the hands of the richest 10% of our society, who are getting wealthier and wealthier, but pay derisory levels of tax, and on the big corporations, who through a myriad of tax loopholes, my committee has been studying these tax loopholes, estimates there's 10 to 15 billion worth of what are called tax expenditures. But they are in fact tax loopholes to give money back to corporations who make a lot of profits. If we introduced a minimum effective corporate tax rate, we could get 4, 5 or 6 billion extra a year in revenues, which we could use for housing, for Brexit protection measures, for the public health service, for children and youth affairs, for all the other really dire needs, for giving workers a little bit of an increase in their incomes, giving them a break on the USE. If we introduce financial transaction tax on the billions worth of trading in derivatives and shares that are going through the IFSC every year, but who won't even accept a 0.1% tax on that trading, which is what the European Union proposes. And indeed, there are many other measures we could introduce in a very wealthy country to redistribute some of that wealth towards the less well-off, towards working people, towards providing affordable housing, towards providing a decent public health service, and towards making the just transition to the climate action we need to prevent a climate disaster. Thanks, Count Corley.
Thank you. Deputy Paul Murphy.